Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome back to our continuing series where we talk to reporters, professors, writers, philosophers, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, mostly academics from universities across America, up to 200 now. And with us today is our privilege to have Professor Jason Sorens. He's at the American Institute for Economic Research. And especially want to say thank you to Professor Ryan D. Griffiths, Political Science, Syracuse University, for hooking this up. Jason Sorens is Senior Research Fellow at AIER. And sorry, just checking something real quick. He's also the principal investigator for the New Hampshire Zoning Atlas. He's the former director for the Center for Ethics in Society at St. Anselm College. He's researched and written more than 20 peer-reviewed journal articles, a book from McGill Queen's University Press titled Secessionism, that's where I found out about him, and the biannually revised book for the Cato Institute, Freedom in the 50 States. His research is focused on housing policy and land use regulation, U.S. state politics, fiscal federalism, and movements for regional autonomy and independence around the world. He's taught at Yale, Dartmouth, and the University of Buffalo, and won awards for his teaching. He lives in New Hampshire currently. There he is. Yale University, PhD in political science, Washington and Lee University, economics and philosophy, BA. Has worked at the American Institute for Economic Research, St. Anselm College, Dartmouth, University of Buffalo, Yale, and the New School University. Lectured in political science. He's been affiliated with the Mercatus Center at the George Mason University since 2008. His primary research interests include fiscal federalism, public policy, and federal system secessionism and ethnic politics. His work has been published in the International Studies Quarterly, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Political Geography, State Politics and Policy Quarterly, and other academic journals. And here's some of the articles that he has written: Regulatory Decentralization, Affordable Housing, Changing Ideological Politics of U.S. State Firearms Regulation, Pre-Colonial Centralization, et cetera, et cetera. Also part of the Free State Project from 2001. But before we go any further, let's check in. Professor, did I say something wrong? Did I get something incorrect about your background?
No, everything was correct there. The second bio was a little older, but that worked well. I am getting a little bit of occasional distortion from your end, but I don't know what's causing it, and it's not constant. It's just at random intervals. So
sorry about that. I can tell you that the recording's coming out very good. So there's not going to be any distortion on the product. So
okay, good.
Let's start with the big boy in the room, political polarization in America. Let's start with the basics. Is it bad? Is it not that bad? Should we be worried? Hey, we had the Vietnam War, we had the Civil War, we've had worse times, we'll get through it. America's a rough and tumble style democracy. Or January 6th, the president saying, I don't accept this election. Massive parts of the population saying, I defy the authority of the Supreme Court. Is that bad? Is this good? How bad is this?
Yeah, I would say that political scientists distinguish between two types of polarization. One is ideological polarization, and the other is affective polarization. So ideological polarization is simply voters in the United States getting further and further apart in their ideological views. So having more and more extreme opinions about policy. And that has certainly been happening in Congress. There's some evidence it's also happening among voters. And in particular, the voters have become much more consistent in their conservative or liberal policy views, not necessarily philosophically consistent, but if they take the conservative position on one issue, they're more likely to take the conservative position on other issues, and same for liberals. So that's definitely been a trend that's happening, and it seems to be happening in part because the parties have moved further apart. They're much clearer in people's minds than they used to be, and so people are kind of adapting their viewpoints to whatever party they identify with. So that's that has both pluses and minuses, you could say. I mean, one positive actually of ideological polarization is that we do have clearer choices in our elections now than we used to. It's clearer that you're going to get different policies from Republicans than you do from Democrats. And so it's, in a sense, easier for voters to make up their own mind. Affective polarization is when people from one party basically dislike people from the other party, right? They have low affect for them in the psychological lingo. And we might think of this as more negative. So this is reflected in people are unwilling to have their children date or marry people of the opposite political persuasion. People tend to be more hostile online to those who disagree with them, that kind of thing. And and that seems negative for our civic culture, our social capital, our levels of trust in each other. So affective polarization is harder to make a positive case for that. Ideological polarization, I think, will have the more interesting political consequences down the road. Now, some people say, "Oh, with how much Republicans and Democrats hate each other now, we're going to get a civil war or something like that." I don't think that's likely, but I do think that what happens with ideological polarization is that anytime the federal government is divided, so you have president of one party and at least one house of Congress of the other party, that you get much more gridlock. And for someone like me who favors small government, that might be a good thing. If you favor big government, it might be a bad thing. I do think it means, though, that the federal government will get weaker in terms of its ability to enforce federal law if, for example, states decide to do their own thing. So that is one potential long-term consequence of this growing ideological polarization.
I saw that in something that you had written that, let me see if I can find it.
It might have been my review of Frank Buckley's American Secession book.
I think that was it. I wrote it down here. Okay, yeah. It was in this article here, which I think was, The New Secessionism, Jason Sorens, September 28, 2020. Review of American Secession, The Looming Threat of National Breakup by F.H. Buckley. By the way, I mentioned personally in that book, so just get that. Everybody should buy a copy. Here, also, we did an interview with F.H. Buckley, if you want to watch that for part of the series. Here was the quote that I wanted to ask you about. Marijuana legalization has become an important issue at the state level precisely because the federal government lacks the capacity to enforce its own laws. What happens when, due to rising debt and the fiscal burden of writing checks to the elderly, infirm, and foreign central banks, the U.S. government lacks the resources to hire agents to enforce federal banking and securities law, food and drug regulations, immigration law, and eventually perhaps taxation itself? The states become more and more de facto independent, filling the gaps left behind as they will. I think that gets at the same concept that maybe you never have anyone say secession, or you never have anyone say we're going to dissolve this union, but the federal government becomes so weak at the center that the governments at the periphery basically take on those activities of the federal government. And effectively we get back to, I don't know, quasi-independence or some form of early proto-federalism. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying?
That's exactly right. So again, marijuana legalization here is the example where you have now legal marijuana stores in a bunch of states, even though it's federally illegal. It's a federal crime still, but the federal government simply lacks the ability to enforce it. What if that happens to food and drug regulation? What if that happens to securities and financial regulation? These are all areas where states might want to do different things from what the federal government has done. And these are areas where the federal government took over at some point in the 20th century. And in other countries like Canada, you don't have a federal role in some of these areas. It's a provincial matter. So I think it's definitely possible to think about states going their own way with a lot of these policies and giving their citizens, in a lot of cases, certain freedoms that the federal government doesn't want them to have, but the federal government's unable to stop it. And as I say here, I think this is more likely when the federal government simply can't tax anymore because it's spending so much on servicing the debt and on writing checks to the elderly, especially Social Security and Medicare. Social Security, Medicare, and interest are all shooting up as a percentage of federal spending. What if we get to the point where the federal government really doesn't have the money to spend on enforcing its own laws? That's the point where you might see the breakup of the U.S. de facto, right? And maybe de jure if one state really wants it for some reason.
I found it interesting because I was watching, there's a podcast called Judge Napolitano. I'm not endorsing him. I'm just pointing out there's a podcast that I watched. Anyways, there was an episode with this Lieutenant Colonel, Karen Kwiatkowski, and she had said something very similar to what you had said. They were talking about that movie, The Civil War, right, that came out. And she goes, again, I don't know if there'll be a civil war, but I could see the point where the federal government becomes so weak and feckless that the states effectively operate independently and that foreign governments recognize them as such. But nobody ever actually said anything. There was never a declaration. So the federal government can walk around still saying, we're United States of America and we're still totally in charge, when basically everybody in America and everybody around the world knows that's not true. But because there was no declaration, we can keep appearances up. But then the power gradually just devolves to the states because you have a central government that's just ineffective, like the Soviet Union right before it collapsed. And it seems similar to what you were saying. Does that seem like a more likely scenario to you than a full civil war or even a peaceful agreement at states seceding?
It does. Civil war, I think, is really unlikely because all the evidence on what causes civil wars, what are the risk factors for civil wars, suggests that the U.S. is at very low risk of civil war. The number one factor driving civil war risk is GDP per capita. If you're a very poor country, you're much more likely to have a civil war than a very rich country. Very rich countries basically never have civil wars. And so there are several reasons for this. I think the most important one is that when the citizens are very rich, they're going to give up a lot if they choose to take up arms against the government. They're giving up their well-paying office jobs and things like that, and that's not very attractive for grabbing an AK-47 and running into the woods, right? That's not not a very attractive proposition to people. So I think civil war is really unlikely. Peaceful secession, where states actually declare independence, is somewhat more likely. But there you would need some state to have a sense of national identity and a strong desire to become independent, a strong desire to see themselves as somehow separate from the rest of the country. I don't think we see a lot of that now. Again, it could happen, but the polls on this show that maybe 20 to 30% of Americans want their state to become independent. And it hasn't really been seriously discussed in any state other than Texas, New Hampshire, Alaska, maybe a few years ago. And so I think once it becomes seriously discussed, a lot of people are not going to follow through on that. I think when the polls show 30% of people want their state to become independent, they're probably just expressing frustration with the federal government and with whoever's running it. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see that kind of national independence movement actually succeed at the state level, at least not in the near future. But what you could have is this de facto radical decentralization where, the federal government's still there. Maybe it's doing defense, maybe it's paying off its debt and writing some checks for certain transfer programs. But basically, in terms of the legal environment that citizens enjoy, it becomes a state by state matter.
So, yeah, actually, let me do that. So when we look at civil war or devolved federalism, um, or some sort of peaceful secession, uh, I think what you're saying is we're not there yet as far as Civil War metrics in America. We're just not ticking off the metrics that looks like a civil war here is likely when we look at other states and countries that have had civil wars. Um, the devolved federalism, we just talked about how that might be a possibility as the federal government becomes more feckless and ineffective and states rise up, like you had the 25 states backed the Texas governor on defying the federal government on the border wall. And then you had, I think 2 years ago during COVID, California, Washington, and Oregon literally formed a Western States Pact and said, we will defy the federal government on the opening of the economies during COVID. We're going to do our own thing. And then additionally, they said that to, I think, the Biden administration at the end of COVID. So you have these coalitions of states that are actively challenging federal power. You're saying, I think, that seems more likely where the future may go than an actual secession attempt that's legal or a full-blown civil war. Is that fair?
That's right. And I would say that peaceful secession could happen if the federal government weakens enough, but you still need that sense of national identity to emerge in one of our states, and we don't see that yet.
What does that mean? States are missing a sense of national identity. My family, I'm Californian, and I could argue the California case, but my family's from Texas. Texas was an independent country. The Texas flag at the same height as the federal government's flag, which pretty much happens in no other state. They routinely talk about how they were independent, don't mess with Texas, and they seem to have some sort of distinct identity going back to the 1850s, where they would say, "Are you an American? I'm a Texican." So does that not qualify when we look at other states that have had successful secession movements?
I grew up in Texas, and I would say that there's certainly a sense of state distinctiveness, and people like to talk about how the state was independent for 9 years. So it's definitely part of the state's identity. But it also seems that the same people who are loudest about Texan identity and assertive about Texan identity are also patriotic Americans and dislike anti-American rhetoric. So that makes me think that Texans and the people who assert Texanness, so to speak, are not really seeing that as an alternative to American identity and being part of the United States, but a supplement to it. Now, again, that could change. Things can change quickly. We saw that with Yugoslavia in the late 80s and early 90s. A lot of people had Yugoslav identities, but those identities unraveled pretty quickly when they needed to assert their ethnic identity in order to be safe. So, those things can spiral, but right now, I would say that while Texans like to talk about they could become independent and be a strong country and have a strong economy, I don't think it's a serious political program yet for anything close to the majority of Texas citizens.
There was some polls that came out by YouGov, and it was saying the top 3 secession movements in America, and it was looking at Alaska, Texas, and California, and it was showing around 30% of the population supports secession in each one of those states. Is 30% a not significant enough threshold for us to take this seriously? And if not, what percentage of the population has to be supportive before we can say, okay, looking around at case studies, this appears to be the threshold level?
Yeah, I think 30% actually is enough to take it seriously when you look at movements abroad that everyone takes seriously, like the Scottish National Party. They were at 30% for independence in the 70s, right? And eventually they built toward something close to a majority, never quite got there. So it could definitely go way up, but the difference is that Scottishness always seemed to be something distinct from Britishness. right? And there are always people would say, well, I'm Scottish, I'm not British, or I'm more Scottish than I am British. But I doubt if you ask that question of Texans or Californians, you get that many people saying, I'm Californian, not American, or I'm Texan, not American. So that sense of national identity still needs to be developed for that to have a shot at getting above 50%. So on the one hand, yes, I would take that percentage seriously, because in international context, there's actually a lot of people who support secession in the US. But I think the obstacles to getting to 50% in any actual election or any referendum are pretty significant in the short term.
So we'd need to be at, oops. Uh-oh. Give it a second. We'll have him come back. He said he had a weak internet signal, but I wanted to try to do the interview anyways because I'd been waiting for a while. There he is. Hi. We're back. We're back. Everything's working out.
Hi, sorry. Yeah.
So no, we only lost like 3 seconds. So you were talking about how the percentages of 30% versus 50%. I think you're saying if you actually had 50% of a population, that's very serious for them being able to pursue independence in some way. 30% is enough to be taken seriously, but it's not enough for you to think this is going to happen eminently. Is that fair? Somewhere between this 30 and 50% range.
Yeah, that's right. I think 30% definitely suggests that there's a constituency for this out there, but you'll need to that will need to grow for this to actually become a true kind of threat to the political status quo. One of the things we do see is that percentage also does fluctuate in states depending on which party holds the U.S. presidency.
Right.
So in Vermont, for example, you used to have a strong secession movement back when George W. Bush was president, but it kind of withered away after Barack Obama was elected. And to me, that says that there's not really that strong kind of permanent base for a national independence movement in Vermont. Now, maybe some other states are different in that respect. I expect the base is sort of permanently higher.
Damn, we were doing so well. Okay, we'll give it another shot. Do you want me to call you?
As I was saying, that base might be permanently. Yeah, I mean that could work for the audio.
Could I have do you want to email me your phone number?
I can, yeah, or I could just drop it in the chat right here. There it is.
Okay. I'm going to call you right now. And I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you so much. I read your book years ago. I have been looking forward to this for a very long time. Okay. Okay, great. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you. So I guess I'll just do it this way, because are you able to grab my audio from this?
Yes. Audio is coming in super crisp and clear. And if the video goes out, the audio will still be going on the entire time. So we won't have any more disruptions. People have seen you, and the audio is coming in very clear. So no more disruptions. We're very good. And we were talking about support for secession fluctuates depending on who wins the presidency. And I think you were suggesting that can you really be that serious about independence and we have a separate national identity if you only talk about independence when your guy doesn't win the election?
That's right. And it's natural for there to be some fluctuation with these percentages. And you see this even with serious independence movements around the world that, the Scottish National Party does better when the Conservatives are in power in Britain. And the Basque and Catalan secessionists do better when the Popular Party's in power in Spain and that sort of thing. However, we see pretty significant fluctuations in aggregate support for independence and which people support independence, depending on who's in office. So it seems that when a Republican holds the presidency, Democrats are more willing to say that they're willing to see their state secede. And when a Democrat is in office, it's Republicans who are more willing to see their state secede.
Right.
So that suggests that to me that, people are expressing their frustration with the federal government, but maybe not expressing this kind of deep-rooted desire for their state to be its own country.
And if it was a deep-rooted desire, we would expect Texas to be as interested in independence when Biden wins as when Trump wins, that it doesn't matter who's elected president, you're still as interested in independence, because that would show kind of an inherent thrust for that sense of nationalism and not just I'm upset about the elections and being emotionally reactive.
Yeah, you should see a high base no matter who's president, and you should see a lot of the same people supporting it regardless of who's in power.
Fair enough. There was a poll that showed that, and I don't know about the accuracy of it. It's just something I saw once. There was a poll showing 40% support for secession in Texas. Does that change anything from a 30%?
Yeah, so what we have seen in Texas, there is the Texas movement and the Texas nationalist movement, I guess they call themselves.
Yep.
And they have been pushing to get Texas independence on this sort of survey that Texas Republican primary voters submit when they vote. And they were unable to do that this time,
right?
Because the party itself kind of shot it down, from what I understand. So there's an active movement there to get this in party platforms and to gauge the real support for this, at least within the Republican Party. I think that's the beginning of something, and we'll see how far it gets. You did have maybe 2 state legislators, I think I saw, who were willing to support introducing some kind of independence referendum bill. So it's a start. I think it still would be characterized as outside the political mainstream in Texas to actually support secession, but it's definitely a part of the political conversation there. So I would take it seriously as a part of the conversation. I would still say there are a lot of obstacles to seeing Texas actually vote to secede at any point within, let's say, the next 10 years. I think that's going to be a tall order. But again, what happens if the federal government becomes much weaker, much less able to protect Americans, much less legitimate in a sense? Could you see Texas make a break for it at that point? And I actually could. So it will be not in the near term, but if I were to guess, I would say somewhere between 20 and 50 years from now, I could certainly imagine something like that happening.
But conditions on the ground could make it come sooner or come much later. I think getting at what you're talking about, Texas was upset with a bunch of migrants coming across the border, and so they started putting up walls or cyclone fencing, and the federal government tore that down. And then their governor said, well, we're going to do it anyways. That seemed to energize support for Texas independence. We're standing tall against the federal government. You don't tell us what to do. You're trying to stop us from being able to protect our people and from being killed and murdered and victimized. It could events like that speed up the interest in independence, where you have a Texas that feels that the federal government is holding them back or not taking their security seriously or standing in front of their government to do these things. And that sort of agitation, like we saw the Biden administration and the Texas government get into this year, could increased agitation, increased support for breaking away. Would that be a possibility?
Yeah, I mean, policy differences between a region and the central government do play a role. We see this internationally, where in places like Catalonia and Flanders, the more those central governments don't let them control taxation powers and social security systems, the more they're willing to pursue independence instead. And for the Scottish nationalists, having a more kind of social democratic or left of center political economy is important. And so if the British government is pursuing conservative policies, conservative economic policies, you see support for independence go up.
Right.
So yeah, these things play a role, and we'll have to see how far it gets. I mean, migration is a tough issue to make the case for independence because it highlights something that is a little bit of a weakness for an independence movement, which is the fact that if you really want to control your borders, and that's your motivation for declaring independence, then you no longer have free movement between Texas and the rest of the United States, right? Because otherwise, the United States could say, well, we're going to let in all these migrants, and then if you have open borders between Oklahoma and Texas, well, the migrants could move to Oklahoma and then down into Texas.
Right.
So you'd have to be willing to bite the bullet of saying, sort of like Britain did with Brexit, we're going to have closed borders despite the economic dislocations that will occur.
Right.
And that may be a political price they're willing to pay, but it is a tougher case to the voters once they confront that kind of trade-off.
There was a survey that came out recently by Newsweek magazine, and it said that according to this Newsweek magazine, most Californians believe they'd be happier if their state seceded, published February 27th, 2024. According to the Independent California poll, which was conducted by YouGov among 500 randomly chosen adults in the state, 58% said Californians would be better off if it peacefully seceded from the Union and had a friendly relationship with the United States. This was one poll by YouGov that showed 58%. I found that to be a particularly high percentage. There weren't other polls doing that, but this was a YouGov poll that came up with that. Assuming that's true, and I don't know, assuming it's true that you had 58%, is that significant? Does that say, wow, something may happen here soon? If we're looking at numbers like that.
Yeah. Again, I think it's significant. I think it's worthy of investigation, given that, this indicates the degree of alienation
from the federal government that a lot of Californians are experiencing. So that's definitely something worth watching. Now, if you're a politician, do you take this and do you say, now I'm going to support California's secession, and that's going to help me kind of win elections, win my primary election, get into office, get into the state legislature? That's going to be trickier. We'll have to see if that's the case. I mean, if politicians believe these numbers, then you'd expect to see them start to do this, to start to promote this as a political platform. But I wonder if a lot of the voters saying that they'd be happier if California were independent also sort of see it as a low probability outcome and as something that is kind of low priority in the political scene. So these are obstacles that can be overcome. I'm reminded of the economist Timur Kuran's idea of preference cascades. So no one takes secession seriously until serious people start taking it seriously, and then all sorts of people start taking it seriously, and you might start to see people changing their minds very quickly on this issue and making it front and center when it hadn't been before. But I don't think we're there yet. So I think it's still seen as a non-mainstream issue by the vast majority of politicians, and for that reason, voters are kind of, you might ask them about this, and they might kind of off the cuff answer a certain way, but they're not making this something that's very salient to the way that they vote. And once we do start to see that, then that's when you'll see the politicians come along and say, yeah, I see this as a vote-winning issue, and I'm going to promote this. And then you could really start to see those people get elected and something happen.
So when Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, you had the Cal Exit movement. And that was where Stanford University and Reuters Ipsos both showed 32% of the state wanted immediate secession, not let's talk about it. It was like full blown. What was less reported was that both Stanford and Reuters showed an additional 15.7% were not opposed to discussing secession. When you add that up, we're getting to close to numbers of 47.5% of Californians did not say no to secession. They said, I want it or I'm willing to talk about it. That gets damn close to that 50% number, doesn't it?
Yeah, and if you're a secessionist, this is the strategy you have to pursue. You have to kind of make secession seem soft. So make independence seem less risky, make it seem more gradual, talk about starting a process as opposed to making it an immediate break. And that gets more support. And that's why in Quebec you had support for a formula they called sovereignty association, which would have kept some Canada-level negotiations between Quebec and the rest of Canada, and free trade and some degree of free movement between Quebec and the rest of Canada. And that made it seem softer to Quebecois voters, and they were more willing to support it than they would have supported complete independence. And so one thing I talk about with American secessionists is that if they really want to make political gains, they probably should not actually talk about the word secession, and they should probably not use the word independence even. They could talk instead about self-government. They could talk about free association, which is a status that the Marshall Islands has, whereby the U.S. government controls defense and foreign policy, but the Marshall Islands are internally autonomous, so they
Right.
control all their own domestic affairs. So these are the types of formulas that kind of try to split the baby a little bit and make this seem, number one, less similar to the tragic Civil War of the 19th century, but also more kind of economically feasible in our interconnected world.
You could not be more right, Professor. It's called the Independent California Institute. That was the group that contracted YouGov to do the poll that showed 58%. But backing up what you said, yes, a lot of Californians said they never thought California could become independent because of the Civil War. That's what you had said, 60%. But then also what you just said, you got to make it a safe idea. Turns out, and the Independent California Institute brought this up, when they say secession, 58% support. When they don't use the word secession or independence and say a special autonomous status and better off, support jumps up to 68%. That seems to back up what you're saying. You stay away from those scary words. Maybe don't have full-blown secession as the option. But Yeah, I mean, this seems to back up what you're saying. You stay away from the scary
Yeah.
words. You stay away from this. I'm talking full blown break, and I'm using words from the Civil War, and you get damn near 2/3 of the people are like, well, hold on, I'm open to that. I don't want secession, but a special status like the Quebecois seems to be more support. Do these numbers make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, those numbers make sense, that voters would be more willing to endorse a policy that seems moderate than one that seems more, frankly, radical. And, that's originally what U.S. federalism was supposed to be. It was supposed to allow states to go their own way in their internal affairs. And it was really the extension of the federal government into areas of state prerogative in the 20th century that made this, I think, an issue to begin with. And so you could argue that this kind of special status, autonomy, restored federalism, self-government, whatever formula you want to use, that this is actually not just lawful, but constitutionally mandatory, that if we were to take the original Constitution seriously, that this is what states must be allowed to have, and that it would be unconstitutional for the federal government to infringe on state powers in these areas. So I do think that there's a case to be made here for for pursuing this kind of middle path that will appeal to more voters, and also, by the way, probably stand up better in court than simply unilaterally declaring independence, because then you have to deal with the Texas versus White precedent. I think that case was wrongly decided, but it is precedential, and so there are going to be some barriers to simply unilaterally trying to declare independence. Many states have constitutional provisions that actually forbid them from becoming independent. I don't know if that's true of California, but certainly some Mountain West states. And so you get around those. You get around those problems if you can choose something that's a bit more moderate and more consistent with our constitutional understanding of the relationship between states and the federal government.
Could you tell the audience briefly what is Texas versus White, and why is it important to this discussion around secession or independence, in your professional opinion?
Yeah, so this was a case decided in 1869 in which the Texas state government was arguing that they were not part of the Union between 1861 and 1865 because they declared independence, and they have the right to do this under the Constitution, citing the 10th Amendment. Because secession was not prohibited to the states, they argued that it was, by implication, allowed. And the Supreme Court decided that states do not have a right, or at least Texas does not have a right, to unilaterally secede. That is, secede just on their own without any approval by the federal government. But by implication, they did hold that states could gain independence with the consent of the other states.
Right. And
it's not clear how that would happen. The most restrictive interpretation is that you'd need some sort of constitutional amendment. The more sort of broad interpretation would be that states could become independent so long as Congress approves it.
Right.
And it could be standing in for the states. You also have the wrinkle that there are some states whose constitutions, both before and after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, explicitly affirm the right to independence. So that is true of New Hampshire, and I believe Virginia as well have state constitutions that explicitly affirm that the federal government has only the powers that the state voluntarily chooses to delegate to them, and that the state may resume those powers at will. So that, it's hard to get a more explicit statement of a right to secession than that. So if one of those states did try to secede, you could make the case that Texas versus White would not apply to them. But right now, for the vast majority of the country, this is the binding precedent.
So Texas versus White is the only Supreme Court case on secession. And as such, we can't just flippantly ignore it, right? I mean, it's the American legal system is based upon stare decisis, case law. There's only one legal decision on secession, Texas versus White, and it says you can't unilaterally secede, but you could secede through something called consent of the states, although consent is not well defined. Is that fair?
That's correct. So this is the precedent you'll have to deal with, and a reason why if you want to gain independence, then you have to build in the likelihood that you'll actually have to get consent of Congress, and you can't just do it unilaterally.
Some people have said that, when Donald Trump was president, he said California's out of control. He routinely attacked the state. His antagonism between the state of California and himself was so famous it was covered in different European news magazines. The man seemed to single out one particular state. The Republican National Convention, the last year that he was president, was focused on how California is the epitome of everything wrong with America and not to be like California. I'm not exaggerating. The Los Angeles Times and San Francisco Chronicle wrote a couple articles about this. You've never had a political party have their annual political convention dedicated to hating one state. And you've never had a president dedicated so focused on hating one state. When I watch Fox News, not regularly, they routinely single out California. I know New York gets a couple hits, but they seem to really like talking trash on California. And there was a poll covered in the Los Angeles Times 2 months ago that showed, I think it was half of all Republicans would be fine with kicking out California. When we look at things like a political party has focused its annual convention on a state, never happened in the last 200 years. A president has focused his ire on a state, never happened in the last 200 years. And we have half of the members of a political party say, I'd rather see you gone. Again, not have seen that since 1860. Would it look like perhaps California might have potentially a plausible ground for making that argument under Texas versus White, arguing for consent from the states?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're California, then you need to probably win a referendum and then petition Congress and hope that Republicans control Congress.
Yeah.
Because it seems as if Republicans would be happier to let California go. And for obvious reasons, right, it would change representation in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Yeah, I mean, I could imagine that we get to that point where a Republican majority in Congress would be happy to see California leave.
Well, it's, as you said, we don't know what consent means. There was this article by GQ magazine, the California Secession Movement's Ecstatic Rise and Unexpected Collapse. They interviewed Professor Erwin Chemerinsky. Professor Chemerinsky is the top constitutional scholar in, I think, America and in California. He's started the UC Berkeley School of Law or something like that, and the UC Irvine. Anyways, in this article, California Secession Movement, he says a simple vote of Congress. In his opinion, a simple vote of Congress could be all that's necessary for consent to be achieved. Does that sound legally plausible?
It does, because who is going to gainsay Congress on this? I mean, you
Right.
have to imagine that the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down both what a state legislature wants to do and what Congress wants to do, and makes them both unhappy.
Right.
And I think that's unlikely. And again, just in terms of the constitutional law of this, it's implausible to read the U.S. Constitution as prohibiting secession. So that's what you would have to do, right? To say that there has to be a constitutional amendment, you have to say, okay, what the U.S. Constitution really says is that secession is illegal for everyone. that's not in the text of the Constitution. So there's no, certainly if you had an original public meaning justice, that's not there, right?
Right.
It's not in the text. And even if you're a living constitutionalist, it seems to me that you'd be more open to, let's say, down the road, social understandings of the union evolve, right? And we have this kind of consensus between the federal government and at least one of the states. It's going to be hard to say that what they want to do is nevertheless not going to be allowed. So it seems to me that the more plausible side of the argument is that it would take a mere vote of Congress to allow a state to gain independence.
One last question. You said if we started to see a future where politicians saw a poll, Californians support secession, okay, but you would need to see politicians acting on it. You would need to see politicians saying, well, there must be so much support, so I need to run on that. Good point. When Donald Trump was president, Gavin Newsom famously went on television and started referring to California as a nation state. He hadn't done that before. He did that on TV while talking about how California's not going to listen to Trump, who was the leader of the federal government. And then he referred to California as a nation state, and he was famously celebrated by California newspapers for doing that. Additionally, you had about 6 members, I know it's not many, but you had 6 members of the California legislature who would give speeches where they would literally say, we don't need the federal government. They didn't say, we don't need Donald Trump. They said, we don't need the federal government. I know that's not a tipping point, but is that the sort of actions by political leaders we would expect to see as a state moves towards an independence mindset?
That's right. And you have to start to see state political leadership focus on state office as their highest ambition, right? So if state political leadership is always hoping to get promoted to the U.S. Senate or to the U.S. presidency, then that's a political tie between the state and the union, and you're much less likely to see politicians approach that tipping point where they say, no, let's call it quits.
Right.
So you would need to see some change in kind of the mentalities of state level politicians in terms of what they consider to be the significant and important venue for their electoral ambitions.
Okay, winding down. Where does this go? I interviewed different professors, and some of them said civil war is possibility. Very few. Most of them said, though, that they didn't really see an end to political polarization in the near future. They kind of hoped it would, and they had solutions they hoped we would perceive. But I'm like, so you see this thing calming down in the next 5 years? No. 10 years? No. 15 years? No. I don't know. I hope it calms down. And then there was a group of professors who said, well, it might not go to civil war, but I could see where the federal government and its relationship with the states devolves to, quotes, a Brazil level of efficiency. Could you see things continuing to devolve in America to the point where we get a Brazil level of democracy and we just stay at that for 20 to 30 years? There was a few professors who predicted that. That terrified me as much as the idea of civil war, that we would be the quality government of Brazil for 20 to 30 years. How possible is that as a possibility for where America may go?
I do think it's plausible, unfortunately, because we've already seen that federal institutions have become more inefficient over time. We've seen that it's incredibly expensive and politically difficult to build anything, to build public infrastructure. And that's true at the federal level, also true for many local governments, New York City, for example. So we already have built in a lot of this kludgeocracy, in the words of Stephen Tellis. We've seen this with a lot of the Biden administration initiatives, like building electric vehicle charging stations. They're supposed to build thousands, spent billions, and ended up building 7.
Right.
So, and I actually don't blame the Biden administration too much for this. I think this is just built into the structure of the federal government, and that the same problems afflict Republican administrations, that they're not able to achieve their objectives because of the inefficiency of the federal bureaucracy. And then when you add to that an exploding debt burden, deficits that seem likely to only increase according to market forecasts, and you end up with a situation where it's kind of it does start to look Brazilian, where politicians are short-termist. They're only thinking about, how can I pay off my coalition over the next 4 years? And they're not, they're willing to kind of eat the seed corn of the economy, so that they can pay off their constituencies, their interest groups. And that's very bad for our future standard of living. But also, in a sense, presents the opportunity to do something new.
As you had mentioned, we have a higher rate of people who will not marry someone who's out of the political party. I think it's jumped by like 12 to 30% over the last decade. Higher percentage of people who will not date. I know personally, half the people that I know have said they have had friends that they've had for 20 to 30 years that for the first time ever, they can't even have a political conversation with. Does this get better? Do we heal as a country, in your opinion? And not just your opinion as a professor. Could you also talk as an American who's living in the boiling cauldron with us? Is this going to calm down? Can I tell my mom, hey, don't worry, it's going to be fine, because she's freaking out every day? Or is there reason to worry? We don't know for a fact this could get better. It, in fact, could get worse. Things, in fact, are bad. They are significantly horrible. We are pulling apart. And watch out, because there isn't signs showing that this could end. Or is that just an overblown concern and it'll be fine? Which one?
Yeah, I think that the ideological polarization will likely get worse, and the inefficiencies in the federal government will likely get worse. Affective polarization, so the antipathy between people of different parties, different ideological orientations, I think that could go either way still. One reason to think it will get worse is that as people's ideological positions move further and further apart, it becomes more plausible to think of their viewpoints as kind of comprehensive outlooks on the world, comprehensive worldviews, where we just don't share the same morality.
Yeah.
So this is, that's something I do hear sometimes out there already, that people think if you have different political views, we just don't even agree on basic moral principles. And so that could simply grow if people continue to move further apart in their political views. But I also see that there are other people out there who are becoming mobilized against at least the affective polarization, who are saying, if you're the sort of person who discriminates against people because of their political views, you're part of the problem. And if we end up with a decisive group in society that itself chooses to discriminate against people who discriminate politically, then we can start to see this flip where people want to at least appear as if they're tolerant of the other side, so that they don't kind of get a bad rap and get looked down on themselves for being one of these discriminators or shit stirrers or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Like,
wind up merchant.
People who are creating the problem. So I could see affective polarization go either way. I'm not completely in a doom mode there, but I do think we're likely to see ideological polarization continue.
Who in America is doing the work of attacking affective polarization? What Democratic or Republican leader is criticizing their own party for being too harsh of the other side and saying we need to be more willing to, listen to their ideas? Can you name any significant players?
Unfortunately, not a lot of political leaders, but we do see it among commentators and public intellectuals. And I think you see this on, even though I kind of disagree with some of them on their political views, I think you see this among some of the kind of never Trump Republican types, because they have experienced being on the outs with their own party, yet they're not a member of the other party either. So they kind of understand what it's like to not be on a team and to have, maybe your own team turn against you. So I think they're potentially a member of this kind of coalition that's in favor of a solution here. I do think you see, even this is maybe the opposite poll from the Never Trumpers, but you see on some of the populists, some of them have tried to adopt, tried to bring together socially conservative views and economically left-wing views.
Right.
And even though that's kind of the opposite of my own
Yeah,
ideological
me
position,
too. Yeah.
Nevertheless, they seem more willing to criticize their own side, and they present potentially a way out where they're willing to see the good in people who are on the other team and make at least alliances of convenience with them. So I think it's some of these people who are left out of this growing binary who are going to be speaking up. I don't know whether that's enough to really influence a lot of people, but I do hear it a lot with even the people I interact with here in New Hampshire, like people in my neighborhood. They tend to say that polarization is really, really bad, and they tend to oppose it, and think that we need to get back to something that's more
pragmatic approach
politics.
to politics.
So there's some bad things with that too. Like
things
the
with that.
era of bipartisanship when Republicans and Democrats just kind of satisfied interest groups. I'll support your interest groups if you support mine, and didn't really have clear political views. That I think is a problem. But I do think that there is this constituency out there for at least increasing our willingness to tolerate the other side and to let them speak, and to let them be hired and to not cancel them, right? And so I do hope that movement for political tolerance grows.
So hopeful. You see signs that there are people saying, hey, I'm tired of all the intolerance, and you hope that grows. Although you may admit, though, when we watch CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, Fox News, Newsbreak, we still see a lot of polarization on most of the major media channels that people get their political news from. Would that be fair?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
One last question, second to last question. Marjorie Taylor Greene said on President's Day, we need a national divorce. Red and blue can't live with each other anymore. To which a lot of newspapers and even Stephen Colbert on The Night Show responded. They quoted a Utah governor who said, oh, Marjorie, you idiot. We don't need a national divorce. We need national marriage counseling. What is national marriage counseling? And who can do that? And how quickly will that heal everything and bring us all back together to love each other? As this was the solution. This was the solution that multiple television shows and multiple newspapers put as the rebuttal to Marjorie Taylor Greene that we should split up. No, you're wrong. We just need national marriage counseling. They must be right. Correct, Professor? Given so many newspapers said that. What does national marriage counseling look like? How easy to achieve? Who will do it? And how soon can we expect results?
Yeah, I don't know what that even is. What I would hope for is something quite a bit more minimal, which is simply that on social media and in our universities, we have a tolerance for pluralism, for letting people speak, for letting them demonstrate, and that we don't have to agree with these people. We don't have to think that they are in any way wise or intelligent or virtuous. We may even think that they're the opposite of all of those things. But nevertheless, let's stop trying to get people fired for their views. Let's stop, trying to censor them, and that will at least allow us to kind of live together. So it's more like what you had as the solution to the wars of religion in Europe in the 17th century. The solution is not, hey, let's all blend our religions, but instead it's, you can have your religion and I'll have mine, and we won't interfere with each other.
That sounds nice. I hope we could achieve that. I also hope we can get to some level of federalism. A lot of people were caught off guard by January 6th. And not everybody thinks it's horrible, but a lot of people thought that was pretty bad. How do we know that there won't be a second January 6th and a third January 6th and a fourth January 6th while we're trying to fix these problems and before we're actually able to calm the country down?
Yeah, we absolutely don't know that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hey, you're the expert. I'm just asking questions.
Right. And, I think it would look different because you're going to have overwhelming security around the Capitol from now on when electoral college votes are being counted. Right? They're not gonna make that particular mistake again.
Yeah.
Just like how TSA isn't going to let anyone sneak onto a plane with explosives in their shoes.
Right.
Again.
Right. Right. Yeah.
They're focused on that one, and they have been for a few years now. So, but that doesn't mean that something similar won't happen. And people on the right will point to some of the BLM violence in the 2020. Summer of 2020, and so we are seeing more political violence. We're still at a lower level of political violence we had in the 1970s.
Of course.
And I hope that we don't go back there. But you could certainly imagine that we're going to see political violence of various sorts, and exactly how that plays out is yet to be determined. Unfortunately, a lot of it, if it still gets focused on, alleged, stealing of elections, you're going to see people try to disrupt vote counts at precincts around the country, and that could get pretty unwieldy. We might end up with many small January 6ths around the country.
Many small January 6ths around the country. Are you familiar with the term bleeding Kansas, Professor?
Yes. Yeah.
So a lot of times when I talk to people, they go, oh, the Civil War could never happen here. And we're not that angry. And I go, they weren't that angry at each other either initially. They had to do 5 to 7 years of reading these newspaper dispatches from a frontier state called Kansas, where they would read about Southerners killing Northerners and Northerners killing Southerners in cold blood. And it was after years of reading that they finally got worked up to the point where they thought they could turn on each other. Could these multiple little January 6th recreate that good old bleeding Kansas feeling?
I certainly hope not. But the problem here with bleeding Kansas was that it was a very high salience election environment. So whoever controlled Kansas controlled whether it was slave or free, controlled those 2 senators, and potentially controlled the future of slavery in America. So the lesson here is that if we somehow were able to make politics much lower stakes, then maybe people would not be as, ready to use all means fair or foul to achieve political power. But unfortunately, I am worried that especially with how these things get treated on social media and the way people use inflammatory rhetoric to condemn the president, the Supreme Court, all of these institutions, depending on which side they are and what decision they're making, that all of that is going to lead to people trying to take matters into their own hands so that they can control what they perceive as high salience, do or die type decisions. So the solution really is to hamstring the federal government, send powers back to the states, and let different states do different policies, and really lower the temperature in Washington, D.C., make it so that what happens in Washington just isn't that important anymore. But, it'll take a long time to do that, and certainly politicians in Washington don't have the incentives to do that. So yeah, I'm not exactly optimistic.
So when people say this is the most important election ever, democracy could literally die depending on how you vote. This could be the end of the world depending on that's not exactly helpful language. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. I think it's very unhelpful language.
So I just got to get, I got to get it out. That's the point of the series, to ask experts and go, blue is blue, red is red. Oh, okay. Okay. Last question. You talked about how the 1970s is more violent than now. True. Political violence was much higher in the 1970s, closer to I think it was the Italian years of lead and the Irish Troubles. I wanted to ask you your opinion, though. A lot of professors have agreed with you. 1970s more violent than now, but they would say that they're more troubled about political polarization now for this reason. There's no unifying respect for common institutions. So in the 1970s, people would have their political issues, but nobody was saying, I'm going to deny that your guy won the presidency for 4 years. And if the Supreme Court says something I don't like, I will defy the court and ignore what they do. And now we have a system where, it's less violent, but people don't have a common faith in the Constitution, a federal government, court, or Congress, when at least back in the 1960s they did. Thoughts, feelings?
Well, that's another reason I think that something like the Brazilian outcome is more plausible, that we end up with lots of disaffected individuals with nowhere to vent their rage, that are probably not well organized. I mean, January 6th was poorly organized.
Right. Yes, of course.
And that's much more likely than the kind of organized rebellions that could actually, bubble up into a civil war. So it's still extremely negative for our political culture and for our future economy and society. But it's a different kind of political violence and a different kind of threat to the system. It's much more based in cynicism and enemy and kind of alienation than it is some kind of organized threat to overthrow the established order.
Right. Okay. We always ask, you don't have to answer. I'll send you a copy of the video and email later. If you could think of anybody you could recommend, an activist, a professor, anybody who might be willing to have a conversation on political polarization. Don't have to name anybody, but we always try to keep the conversation going. The last question I have is, you're not you, you're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview. And they're going, wow, I learned a lot. There was some very awkward, tough questions there, and they were answered directly, and we got some real insight onto some tough issues to talk about. But there was a lot discussed, and I'm struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing that the professor said when talking about political polarization, and boy, it's 5 days after I watched that interview, and I still can't get that one thought about polarization the professor said out of my head. What is that one sticky thought you want someone to not be able to forget 5 days after watching this interview, Professor?
I would say the one thought is that to solve a lot of these issues with political polarization, and the growing inefficiency and even outright corruption in the federal government, we really do need to decentralize power and to make what happens in DC much less important. And if government is not all powerful, if the important things that happen in our neighborhoods and our companies in the marketplace and our social relationships, community organizations, and state and local government, then it's going to decrease the temperature quite a bit, and it's going to make our system work better than it does now, because the way things are going, we could easily end up with a situation where the federal government does very little because it's inefficient and it's deeply in debt, and that may end up with a scenario that a lot of us small government types want, but we'd have to go through a lot of difficulty first to get there, and I don't think we want that outcome.
Okay, there's a lot there. Thank you for your time. I know that you've had home construction and internet difficulties, and I want to say thank you for being flexible and thank you for working with me. I hope this was a painless interview.
Yeah, it was fun.
Okay. Would you ever be willing to come back, maybe in the future? Not immediately, but after a while.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. I will email you a copy of the show, and I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor, and I really deeply appreciate your time, and thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus.
Okay. That'll be it, and I'll send you a copy soon. Thank you, everybody, for coming out, and we'll see you soon.